In the 2011 film Contagion, the filmmakers set the scenario for a disease outbreak that threatens to destabilise society. When Beth Emhoff, played by Gwyneth Paltrow, returns home from a Hong Kong business trip, she brings with her a deadly new disease. 2 days later, she's dead, and the film traces the spread of the disease from her to a global pandemic. This chill-inducing scenario attributes the origin of the disease to a piece of pork from a pig that had been exposed to contamination via a bat dropping. 10 years later, and the film has earned a new cult following, as the world braces itself for the impact of a new disease. The outbreak of the SARS coronavirus in 2002 infected more than 8,000 people, and nearly 800 people died. Almost 2 decades later, the outbreak of a new coronavirus, named by the WHO as COVID-19, has created a healthcare crisis unseen in a generation. Both of the outbreaks began in China, and when tracing their origins, both viruses were found to likely originate from wet markets. So why have we seen multiple new diseases emerge from China, and how conclusive is the link to wet markets? Many viruses and diseases that we live through have originated from animals, including coronaviruses. With SARS, the virus was traced to civet cats, while with COVID-19, early reports indicated that infection from a bat had crossed into a pangolin and then into a human. The precise location had been narrowed down to a specific wet market in Wuhan. However, those early studies have since been brought into refute. It remains unclear and unlikely that a pangolin was involved. In addition, the established timeline of the outbreak, which enables researchers to identify a specific wet market, is also under question. It seems most likely that bats were the original carriers, but other details are unclear.
Back in 2003, at the coronavirus outbreak that occurred in China, it was not understood immediately what had happened. So the Chinese took this very seriously, and towards the end of the outbreak, they began to do some studies in the animal markets in China. This was never completed because the funding dried out, and the interest in the outbreak waned after the outbreak had been fully contained, which is unfortunate because had that research continued, they could have possibly done more to find out what was going on and how you might prevent these in the future.
Wet markets are common in Asia, where many locals shop for groceries. In some, live animals are available for slaughter and sold for consumption. The range of animals available, their proximity to one another, and the poor enforcement of regulations has turned some of these markets into a catalyst-type environment for viruses to make the leap from animals to humans.
There are many reasons why viruses tend to emerge in China and Southeast Asia, a lot of which we're not really going to be able to change. So while you can try to sanitize the environments in which people raise and sell meat, there are always going to be breaches of that kind of biosecurity.
A wide variety of animals can be kept in close proximity, stacked atop one another in squalid conditions. Hygiene is compromised when fluids from animal slaughter or excretions mix. These conditions create an opportunity for a virus to make the jump between other animals, which can then infect humans when handled or consumed. A metaphorical petri dish cultivating potential infection combinations.
Wet markets are the ideal environment for having an effective interface between all sorts of pathogens. I mean, whether that's actually derived from livestock species, if you've got like chickens and like pigs, or it's even more extreme if you bring in wild animals. And there are also different trade interfaces. We've got lots of different stores. And so everybody has different ways of keeping the place clean. And you've got this open space. You've got consumers moving around. So there's an incredible potential for movement of pathogens, transmission of pathogens.
While wet markets aren't unique to China, the markets in China have a few components that work in conjunction to make these environments particularly worrying in the potential for new disease. Firstly, the variety of animals, from common farming animals to the exotic and sometimes endangered species. Animals which can be slaughtered on site, kept in close proximity and in unhygienic conditions. And finally, the markets are located in and around densely populated Chinese cities, which enables the rapid spread of the new disease once it passes into humans.
People have to realize that they're handling potentially infectious organisms and that there is a risk that those infectious organisms can be transmitted from an animal to a human. And I do think that they need to have some oversight because these are potential biohazard risks, just like we have oversight over a nuclear plant. And I think that's what the real issue is can you do this safely?
This utilisation and farming of the wildlife in China has been encouraged by the government and is supported by legislation. In the 1970s, in response to poverty and famine which killed more than 36 million people, the desperate communist regime allowed some private farming to return and gave up control of total food production. This is where the majority of wildlife farming in China began. The Chinese government, intent on supporting small farmers, encouraged this practice. In 1988, the Chinese government enacted legislation which protected the lawful rights and interests of people developing or utilising wildlife. Called the Wildlife Protection Law, it extended special state protection to anyone intending to domesticate and breed wildlife. With wildlife farming sanctioned by the state, this increased the variety of wild animals in farms. In China, the use of exotic and often endangered animals remains a problem. Some wet markets have operated in tandem with the illegal trade of endangered animals, providing the opportunity for endangered and rare species of animal to end up in close proximity to other exotic animals. In response to the outbreak of SARS, China banned wildlife farming and shut down wet markets, only to lift the ban on 54 species of animal, including the civet cat which SARS was traced to shortly after the outbreak. In response to COVID-19, the Chinese government has placed a temporary ban on the farming and consumption of wildlife animals, and is reportedly amending the Wildlife Protection Law, but ending the trade outright could prove to be difficult.
We really need to prevent it. And that has to happen at different steps. It has to happen at the interface between livestock and wild animals and humans and wild animals. And that's where the wet markets come in. But at the same time, going in there and shutting down wet markets is not that simple because they're part of people's livelihoods, they're part of the culture. And there's also the demand for these products. The moment you don't allow the markets anymore, those products will be sold via the internet.
The cultural roots of China's use of wildlife are extensive, not just for food, but also for traditional medicine, clothing, ornaments, and social status. The new ban leaves an exemption for wildlife used in traditional Chinese medicine, or TCM. The use of traditional medicine is strongly promoted by the government. New laws introduced in 2017 legitimised TCM practices by requiring practitioners to pass tests and for TCM institutions to be introduced into hospitals. For example, the ban prohibits the consumption of pangolins, but it doesn't ban the use of their scales in traditional Chinese medicine. Whilst China has offered assurance on regulation, there's concern that this potential loophole will allow for the continued trade and consumption of exotic animals. An important point worth noting is the very limited popularity of these practices in the greater population.
Wet markets in China really are part of the fabric of everyday life here. One trend that has come more recently is this interest in eating exotic wildlife. It's not something that everybody does. What is always the issue with regulating things in China is that this is a vast country. It's a country of 1.4 billion people. And so there's always a challenge for officials on the ground to be able to make sure that everyone is doing what they're meant to be doing. And so with all of this, in terms of wet markets in general, being again so much a part of everyday life, it just gets to be really difficult when you're looking at how to make sure all the vendors there are selling only things that they're licensed to sell.
China is not the only country where these emergence events occur. And so what we need to understand is more how we can make populations understand the risks of buying these live animals and how they can protect themselves if they do.
What COVID-19 indicates clearly is our global interconnectedness, and in the case of outbreaks, total containment to a localized region is virtually impossible.
Initially in the COVID-19 outbreak, China clamped down on the epicenter of that virus by making sure that people were confined to their houses and attempting to stop international travel from that area and also travel within China. And they had hoped that they could interrupt transmission of this virus as well.